A woman sits in a doctor's office, her hands trembling with nervous excitement. She has struggled for years to conceive, and today she finally has hope. The doctor assures her that the sperm donor has been carefully selected. He's the perfect genetic match. But what she doesn't know is that the donor isn't anonymous. It's her doctor. For decades, Dr. Donald Cline was praised as a fertility pioneer. But behind closed doors, he was committing one of the most horrifying violations of medical trust in history, fathering over 100 children without his patient's consent.
My God, what is going on? I'm gonna take you down with a bunch of other moms who will stand behind me.
We were determined to stop him.
Don't mess with a mom.
This is the chilling true story of Dr. Donald Cline, the doctor who deceived his patients, betrayed their families, and changed the lives of over 100 children forever. Who was Dr. Donald Cline? For years, Dr. Donald Cline was regarded as one of the top fertility doctors in Indianapolis. He had built a reputation as a pioneer in reproductive medicine, helping hundreds of couples who struggled to conceive. His patients trusted him completely. To them, he was a miracle worker, someone who could give them the family they had always dreamed of. Cline's clinic operated in a time before DNA testing and strict fertility regulations. Back then, patients didn't question their doctors, they simply followed their advice. When a couple came to his clinic needing a sperm donor, he assured them that he had access to highly qualified donors, often medical residents or specialists with strong genetics. The process was supposed to be anonymous, ethical, and safe. But in reality, Dr. Cline had no intention of using donor sperm from other men. Instead, he was using his own sperm without telling his patients. Women who thought they were receiving sperm from a carefully selected donor were unknowingly being impregnated by their own doctor. And for decades, no one had any idea. But how did he manage to keep this a secret? And how did the truth finally come to light? The answer is as disturbing as the crime itself. How he got away with it. Dr. Donald Cline operated at a time when fertility treatments were poorly regulated. In the 1970s and 1980s, artificial insemination was still a relatively new field, and there were no strict guidelines governing how donor sperm should be handled. Patients relied entirely on the word of their doctor, trusting that he was acting in their best interest. There were no DNA testing services, no national donor tracking system, nothing that could have easily exposed him. Cline's reputation as a respected medical professional made his deception even easier. Women seeking fertility treatment were often at their most vulnerable, desperate for a child, willing to put their complete faith in his expertise. He spoke with authority and reassurance, convincing them that the process was safe and ethical. His patients never suspected that the man they trusted was secretly violating them in the most horrifying way possible. When a woman came to Dr. Cline's clinic for artificial insemination, she believed she was receiving carefully screened donor sperm, usually from medical students, specialists, or individuals who matched the physical and intellectual traits she requested. Cline personally reassured them that each donor was carefully chosen. If a couple wanted a donor who was tall with blue eyes or highly educated, Cline would nod and say, "We have the perfect match." But that was a lie. Behind closed doors, he was using his own sperm, sometimes even moments before the procedure. His patients had no idea that the child they were carrying was biologically his. He did this repeatedly, to hundreds of women, violating the most sacred trust between a doctor and a patient. And for decades, no one questioned him. There was no way for families to prove what had happened. A child might grow up looking nothing like the donor they were promised, but at the time, there was no method to trace DNA, no easy way to uncover the truth. But science caught up to him, and when it did, his entire web of deception unraveled. The DNA test that exposed everything. For years, Dr. Donald Cline's secret remained buried, hidden behind medical trust and a lack of technology. But in 2014, one woman unknowingly set off a chain reaction that would bring his crimes to light. Her name was Jacoba Ballard. She had always known she was conceived through artificial insemination, but like many donor-conceived children, she was curious about her biological origins. She wanted to know more about her ancestry, her medical history, nothing unusual. So she took a 23andMe DNA test, expecting to find distant relatives or ethnic background details. But what she found instead was impossible to explain. Instead of one or two genetic matches, Jacoba discovered multiple half-siblings, people she had never met, all linked by DNA. Confused, she reached out to them. As they began talking, they realized something shocking. Each of them had been conceived through the same fertility clinic in Indianapolis. At first, the discovery seemed like a bizarre coincidence, but as more people took DNA tests, the number of matches kept growing. First, there were 5, then 10, then 20. With every test, the list of half-siblings expanded. Soon, there were over 50 genetic matches, all connected to one man. And when they finally uncovered the identity of their biological father, it wasn't an anonymous medical student or a carefully chosen donor. It was Dr. Donald Cline himself. One man, over 100 children. The horrifying truth was finally out. But now that his deception had been exposed, one question remained. Would he finally face justice? The legal battle. The DNA evidence against Dr. Donald Cline was undeniable. Over 100 children had been genetically linked to him, and the testimonies of his former patients confirmed what had once seemed impossible. He had secretly inseminated women with his own sperm without their consent. For the families affected, the betrayal was unforgivable. These women had placed their trust, their bodies, and their dreams of motherhood in his hands, never suspecting that their doctor was violating them in one of the most personal ways imaginable. The children he fathered grew up believing they had been conceived using an anonymous, carefully selected donor, only to find out their biological father was the very man who had lied to their mothers. With more victims coming forward, the case seemed open and shut. There was overwhelming proof, a clear abuse of power, and decades of deception. Surely, this man would face serious consequences, right? But when the victims turned to the legal system, they faced a disturbing reality. There were no specific laws against what Dr. Cline had done. At the time of the case, fertility fraud wasn't considered a criminal offense in Indiana. There were no federal laws regulating how sperm donors were handled, and nothing on the books specifically making it illegal for a doctor to secretly use his own sperm on patients. He had violated their trust, but in the eyes of the law, there was no direct crime to charge him with. Sexual assault charges? Impossible. He hadn't physically forced himself on anyone. Medical malpractice? Technically, no, because the procedures had been performed correctly, just not with the promised sperm. Fraud? There were no legal precedents for this kind of case. With no clear path to charge him for what he had actually done, prosecutors had to get creative. Instead of charging him for violating his patients, they charged him with obstruction of justice, a far lesser crime. He had lied to investigators when they first questioned him about using his own sperm, and that was something they could prosecute. In 2017, Dr. Cline pleaded guilty to 2 counts of obstruction of justice, but the punishment was almost laughable. He received a 1-year suspended sentence, meaning he never spent a single day in prison. For the families he deceived, this was a devastating failure of the legal system. A man who had violated the most sacred trust between a doctor and a patient was walking free because the law had never anticipated a crime like his. And if Dr. Cline had gotten away with it, how many other doctors had done the same? The aftermath. Dr. Donald Cline may have walked free, but the damage he caused didn't end with his trial. The families he deceived were left with unanswered questions, shattered trust, and an unthinkable reality. Their lives were built on a lie. For the children he fathered, The revelation created an identity crisis unlike any other. Many of them had grown up believing they were conceived with an anonymous donor, only to discover that the man who had treated their mothers was their biological father. Some had already started their own families, only to find out they had dozens of half-siblings they never knew existed. This led to an even bigger fear: accidental inbreeding. With so many children unknowingly related, how could they be sure they weren't dating or even marrying their own half-sibling? The case also opened the floodgates for more fertility fraud cases to come to light. After Cline's exposure, DNA testing companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe led to more discoveries. Other fertility doctors around the world had done the exact same thing. Some estimates suggest that dozens of doctors may have secretly used their own sperm, and with modern technology exposing them one by one, the true number of victims may never be known. In response to public outrage, some states began passing laws criminalizing fertility fraud, making it illegal for doctors to use their own sperm without explicit consent. But for Dr. Cline's victims, it was too late. The laws didn't apply retroactively, and he would never be punished for what he did. To this day, Dr. Cline lives freely in Indianapolis. He has refused to speak publicly about his actions, and despite DNA evidence proving he fathered over 100 children, he has never shown any remorse. His case raises a terrifying question: how many more doctors have done the same thing? And with modern DNA testing continuing to uncover dark secrets, what other horrifying truths are waiting to be revealed? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.